Hello, my dear friends. Settle in and let's journey back in time together. Tonight, we're not just visiting another century, we're stepping into a world of incredible contradiction. We are exploring a time when daughters, in the name of protection, were sometimes locked into metal contraptions. A time when a woman's chastity, if lost, could be crudely and painfully stitched back into place by a back-alley surgeon. And perhaps strangest of all, a time when nearly every natural female desire was not just frowned upon, but officially labelled as a disease, a sickness of the mind that desperately needed to be cured. When we think of the Victorian era, our minds often conjure images of gaslit streets, romantic poetry, and ladies in beautiful, long skirts sipping afternoon tea. But that polished surface hid a much darker, stranger reality. Beneath the politeness and propriety, it was a society obsessed with control, a society where human desire was constantly monitored, ruthlessly repressed, and twisted into some of the most bizarre and creepy sets of rules you can possibly imagine. This was an age of unbelievable paradoxes. It was a time when doctors prescribed buzzing, mechanical vibrators as a legitimate medical treatment for female anxiety. An era when see-through nightgowns, made of the thinnest lace and gauze, were somehow considered the height of morality, and a world where a simple, heartfelt love letter, if it contained the wrong kinds of words, could be presented as criminal evidence and land you in a prison cell with hard labor. So tonight, let's gently open the door to that hidden world and take a look at the most bizarre sexual secrets of the Victorian era. It's more than just a collection of strange facts. It's a journey into the heart of a society gripped by fear. A journey that reveals just how far people will go and how tightly they will try to control the human heart when they are terrified of what it might want. If you've ever found yourself romanticizing the idea of a Victorian marriage, picturing couples taking long, candlelit walks through foggy English gardens, you might want to pause and reconsider that image. The reality of courtship and marriage was often far less about romance and much more about regulation. What actually happened in the quiet drawing rooms and cold, sterile medical offices of that time was stranger and often more chilling than any Gothic novel. You see, beneath the delicate lace gloves that covered every proper lady's hands, and under the tightly laced corsets that reshaped their very bones, there existed a level of sexual surveillance that is almost impossible for us to comprehend today. It makes the world of modern dating, with all its apps and awkward conversations, look as lawless and free as the Wild West in comparison. Every glance, every word, and every feeling was subject to intense scrutiny. In Victorian Britain, a woman's virginity was not simply a personal virtue, it was a public commodity, an asset to be managed. It wasn't just valued, it was actively policed. Her purity was inspected by doctors, medically certified on paper, and in the most desperate cases, it was completely and secretly fabricated before the wedding night. It was less a state of being and more a product to be delivered. The stakes could not have been higher. A young woman's entire future, her social standing, her financial security, and her family's good name, all of it often hinged on the physical state of one tiny, invisible membrane. The weight of an entire life, of generations of reputation, was placed upon the most fragile part of her, a part she herself could neither see nor control. Now, the idea that a bride must arrive at the marriage bed it's a virgin was certainly nothing new. It's a concept that has existed for centuries. But the Victorians, with their obsession for order and scientific validation, took this ancient idea to a frightening new level. They wrapped it up in the new, authoritative language of medicine and reinforced it with an unshakable sense of male entitlement, turning a moral preference into a cold, hard requirement. It was no longer a matter of quiet honor or whispered reputation. It was now about evidence. For the rising upper and middle classes, who were desperate to secure their new place in society, a man's promise and a woman's love letters simply weren't enough. When it came to their future daughter-in-law, they wanted cold, clinical, medical proof of her purity. And the doctors of the era, who were themselves eager to establish their new professional authority, were more than happy to play their part. They became the unofficial, and sometimes official, inspectors of morality. A young woman, often without her full understanding or consent, could be taken to a doctor's office and forced to undergo a profoundly humiliating examination, all to get a piece of paper certifying that she was still intact. These so-called virginity checks were almost never arranged by the man she was to marry, but by the parents. A marriage was, in many ways, a business merger between two families, and this was part of the due diligence. The entire ordeal was cloaked in the soft, caring language of fatherly concern, but at its core, it was a transaction driven by social anxiety. It was about protecting the family's investment and ensuring the bloodline was pure. The strangest part is that the very premise of the examination, the idea that a doctor could visually confirm virginity with certainty, was, even at the time, known to be scientifically flimsy. But the facts did not matter. In a world that was deeply terrified of female sexuality and the chaos it could represent, what mattered most was the illusion of certainty. This medical check provided a comforting, if false, sense of order. This incredible obsession naturally created a secret, underground market for deception. For the women who found themselves trapped by these impossible standards, a few desperate options began to emerge. Some resorted to using artificial hymens, which were crudely made from materials like rubber, fish bladder, or other animal membranes, and were circulated through discreet, word-of-mouth networks of midwives and sympathetic women. These sad little devices, sometimes marketed as virginity restorers, were designed to do one simple, theatrical thing: produce a small amount of blood on the wedding night. The goal was to create that all-important stain on the bedsheets, because in this society, that single, visible mark of proof was considered more valuable and more trustworthy than a lifetime of genuine character. For the women who had lost their virginity, whether it was through a consensual relationship, a moment of coercion, or a violent assault, this act of deception wasn't about trying to be seductive or cunning. It was a raw, desperate act of survival. In a world where even a whisper of suspicion could derail a wedding, ruin a family, and cast a woman into lifelong disgrace, a small, painful lie was their only shield. And so, the wedding night itself, which should have been a private and intimate moment, was transformed into a tense, public trial. The bedsheets were no longer just linen, they were a witness stand, expected to display the evidence of the bride's purity for all to see. In some of the most zealous households, that stained piece of cloth was actually cut out, preserved, and sometimes even framed as a grotesque family treasure. This pervasive terror was amplified by a constant barrage of warnings from every corner of society. Doctors in their new medical manuals solemnly cautioned that perfectly normal activities like riding horses, doing gymnastics, or even just climbing a flight of stairs too quickly could accidentally destroy a woman's purity. The hymen was treated not as a part of the body, but as a fragile, priceless family relic that had to be guarded at all costs. Then, once the wedding was over and the trial of the wedding night had been passed, you might think the surveillance would finally end. But it didn't. It simply changed form. Once a woman became a wife, her purity was no longer judged by a physical membrane, but by something far more subtle and impossible to prove: her emotional reaction in the bedroom, or more specifically, her complete and total lack of one. You see, in the strange and repressed Victorian imagination, a respectable woman was not supposed to enjoy physical intimacy at all. Female desire was not just seen as unladylike or discouraged as a matter of etiquette. It went much further than that. It was medically denied, officially erased from the definition of a proper woman, and actively redefined as a pathology, a sickness that proved something was deeply wrong with you. The ideal wife was given a name, a title that came from a hugely popular poem by a man named Coventry Patmore. She was called the angel in the house. This wasn't just a romantic nickname, it was a job description. The angel was expected to be eternally patient, morally pure, and completely submissive to her husband in all things. In the bedroom, her role was not one of partnership but of pious duty. She was to endure intimacy for two reasons only: to give her husband relief and to produce children for the family line. Her own pleasure was never part of the equation. Because of this, expressing any kind of enthusiasm was seen as a major red flag, a sign that something was wrong with her character. A woman who seemed to enjoy the physical side of marriage was not seen as healthy or in love. She was seen as fallen, possibly corrupt. Passion was not a virtue to be celebrated in a Victorian woman. It was a dangerous character flaw, an illness of the spirit that needed to be corrected before it could infect the rest of the family. This wasn't just a social preference, it was backed by the highest medical authorities of the day. The most influential voice on the subject was a respected London surgeon named Dr. William Acton. In his widely read medical text, he wrote a sentence that would echo for decades, stating plainly that the majority of women, happily for society, are not very much troubled by sexual feelings of any kind. This idea, coming from a man of science, became medical gospel. It gave husbands, fathers, and doctors the proof they needed to justify a world that denied female desire. This cold, medical verdict meant that for many couples, marital relations became a silent, solemn duty, performed with the emotional warmth of a business transaction. The model wife was one who would lie perfectly still, perhaps with her eyes closed and her hands folded neatly over her stomach, trying her best not to react at all. That was considered the picture of feminine grace and modesty. In fact, the culture was so repressed that to even breathe heavily during intimacy could be interpreted as a sign of a defective, overstimulated character. From the husband's perspective, this created a strange and suspicious dynamic. If his wife, against all expectations, actually seemed to enjoy herself, his first thought might not be happiness but doubt. He might wonder, with a rising sense of alarm, where did she learn to feel that? Who taught her to enjoy this? A natural human response was twisted into evidence that she might have a secret, shameful past. And so, women were trapped in a vicious, impossible cycle. Their natural curiosity was treated as evidence of corruption, and their silence became their only shield, their only safety. This began in childhood. Young girls were taught absolutely nothing about their own bodies, other than the urgent need to keep them covered, quiet, and under control at all times. Their own biology was a mystery they were forbidden to solve. The emerging medical field of gynecology, which should have been a source of help and understanding, often just made things worse. It frequently treated female pleasure not as a natural part of life, but as a medical problem to be solved. A woman who expressed arousal, or even just dared to complain about being dissatisfied with her quiet, passionless life, could find herself diagnosed with a whole range of strange, invented conditions. The most famous and most common among these invented conditions was hysteria. It was a diagnosis with a long, strange history. The term itself came from the ancient Greek belief in a wandering womb, a bizarre idea that the uterus was a free floating organ that could travel throughout a woman's body, pressing on her lungs or heart and causing all kinds of chaos. In the Victorian era, this ancient idea was given a modern, medical-sounding update. Hysteria became the ultimate catch-all diagnosis, a convenient label for almost any female behavior that men found difficult or inconvenient. If a woman cried too often, she was hysterical. If she was anxious, irritable, or suffered from insomnia, it was hysteria. Even just being unusually talkative could earn you the diagnosis. By some historical estimates, hysteria was the single most common diagnosis given to women in the latter half of the 19th century. It was the perfect medical tool for a society that wanted to maintain order, a simple way to dismiss any form of female dissent, unhappiness, or intellectual curiosity as a mere medical symptom that could be treated and, hopefully, silenced. And the so-called treatment for this widespread condition was perhaps the strangest part of all. It often involved a doctor performing what was clinically described as a pelvic massage. This was a hands-on, clinical procedure where the physician would manually stimulate the patient's genitals until she experienced what they coyly referred to in their medical notes as a hysterical paroxysm. Let's be very clear about what that means. These paroxysms were orgasms. Yet in the strange coded and deeply repressed language of the time, neither the doctors nor the patients were ever allowed to call them that. The entire process was framed as a purely medical, non-sexual treatment, as if they were simply relieving some kind of unfortunate fluid buildup or calming a woman's overactive nerves. The sad irony is that for many, many women trapped in passionless marriages, these bizarrely sterile medical appointments were the only path they had to any kind of sexual release. The doctor's office became this strange, cold, detached space where their bodies were finally allowed to respond freely and naturally, even if the emotional context was completely absent. In fact, this treatment became so routine and so popular that doctors began to openly complain about it. They wrote in their journals about how incredibly time-consuming and labor-intensive these manual massages were. It was tiring work, and it was apparently causing a great deal of strain on their hands and wrists. A new solution was needed. This very specific, very strange problem of tired doctors' hands led directly to one of the most surprising inventions of the era, the electromechanical vibrator. Its original purpose had absolutely nothing to do with female pleasure or empowerment. It was invented purely for medical efficiency. It was a labor-saving device for the physician, designed to bring a woman to paroxysm faster and with less effort. This deep and pervasive fear of female pleasure didn't stop at the marriage bed, or even in the doctor's office. It extended even further, into the most private and solitary corners of a person's life. It launched a full-scale war against the act of masturbation, or as the Victorians more grimly called it, self-abuse, or the solitary vice. What followed was a full-blown medical and moral panic that swept across the 19th century. In a rare show of unity, doctors, preachers, educators, and parents all joined together in a frantic crusade to eradicate what they considered a silent, soul-destroying epidemic that was corrupting the nation's youth. The simple act of touching oneself was no longer just frowned upon, it was completely demonized. Medical manuals and popular health books, like the hugely popular Plain Facts for Old and Young by Dr. John Harvey Kellogg, were filled with terrifying warnings about the consequences of this private act. Masturbation was blamed for an unbelievable list of ailments, from the infamous claim that it would cause blindness to a host of other horrors, including insanity, heart failure, epilepsy, and memory loss. And these weren't just vague warnings whispered between adults. They were printed in bold letters in books that were given to children and taught as fact in schools. Some of these books even included horrifying illustrations that showed healthy, bright-eyed boys slowly withering away, becoming hunched-over, hollow-eyed madmen, their lives ruined by their secret sin. This widespread panic led some parents to take truly disturbing, physical measures to stop their children. In the most extreme households, mothers and fathers began searching for ways to physically prevent their children from being able to touch themselves at night. Some would resort to sewing the sleeves of their children's nightgowns completely shut, while others would literally tie their children's hands to the bedposts before they went to sleep. The physical restraints went even further, becoming instruments of literal torture. For boys, there were devices like the anti-masturbation ring, sometimes known by its clinical Latin name, the jugum penis. These were sharp, unforgiving metal rings designed with inward-facing spikes that were placed around the penis at night. The cruel logic was simple and brutal. If any natural arousal occurred during sleep, the boy would be woken by a sharp, sudden pain, teaching his body to associate a natural function with punishment and fear. And if that wasn't enough, there were even more elaborate contraptions. These were essentially full-blown male chastity belts, grim devices made of leather and reinforced with rigid metal plates. They were fitted with locks and keys, designed to prevent any physical access whatsoever. Imagine, In an age of steam engines and emerging electricity, parents were turning to medieval-style technology, not to protect their children from the world, but to protect their children from themselves. And the girls were not spared in this crusade either. For them, there were similar chastity devices, often resembling small, uncomfortable cages that covered the entire pelvic area, making self-touch impossible. What's most shocking is that these weren't strange items sold in back alley curiosity shops. They were marketed directly to terrified parents through official-looking medical catalogues, and were sometimes even prescribed by the family doctor, giving this bizarre practice a veneer of scientific legitimacy. When these physical barriers failed, the so-called cures were just as brutal. Doctors prescribed a whole range of treatments designed to shock the system into submission. These included everything from ice-cold baths to dietary restrictions to jolts of electric shock therapy. For boys, some doctors went so far as to prescribe circumcision, not for any medical or religious reason, but purely as a painful deterrent, a permanent and traumatic reminder of the price of their supposed sin. For girls, the recommended cure was even more horrific and frankly difficult to speak about. In the most extreme cases, a doctor might recommend the surgical removal of the clitoris. This barbaric act of mutilation was justified in medical texts as a therapeutic intervention, a way to calm a girl's overstimulated nerves. But let's call it what it was, a punishment rooted in a deep-seated fear of the female body and its capacity for pleasure. And it is absolutely crucial to understand that these were not fringe ideas from a few rogue quacks. These beliefs were supported by the mainstream science of the time. Respected medical journals published serious articles claiming that the loss of semen would physically weaken a man's body, leading to an early death. They wrote that female stimulation could cause the uterus to become displaced, and that repeated self-abuse would lead to the complete decay of the nervous system. When the ultimate authority in a society, the voice of science and medicine, is driven by fear instead of curiosity, the human body inevitably becomes its battlefield. And the casualties of this war were the children. They grew up learning to believe that their own bodies were dangerous, that their natural instincts were dirty, and that their most private thoughts were proof of a deep, inner corruption. And yet, for all this brutal, top-down repression, the medical world had simultaneously, almost accidentally, created a bizarre loophole for women. It didn't look like freedom, and it certainly wasn't called pleasure. It looked like treatment, and it came in the form of a strange new mechanical device that buzzed and hummed, and promised to restore a woman's emotional balance, the vibrator. These early, clunky vibrators were powered by all sorts of new technologies, some by cumbersome batteries, others by foot pedals, and a few early models even ran on steam. They were designed to allow doctors to induce that hysterical paroxysm much more quickly and efficiently than they could with their hands. And they were carefully marketed, not as taboo sexual objects, but as respectable, high-tech health appliances. You could find advertisements for these new massages in the pages of mainstream women's magazines, right alongside ads for soap and sewing machines. They were sold as miracle cures for a whole list of socially acceptable female complaints: nervousness, headaches, back pain, and general fatigue. Their true purpose, the one that doctors and patients seemed to understand without ever speaking it aloud, was hidden in plain sight. This created a level of hypocrisy that is truly mind-boggling to consider. A respectable woman could not, under any circumstances, openly discuss her sexual needs or desires with her own husband. That would be shameful. But she could, without raising a single eyebrow, go to a doctor's appointment or use a buzzing machine on her pelvis in the privacy of her home every evening, all under the perfectly moral guise of managing her nerves. The deep-seated need for release hadn't been eliminated. The repression was simply redirected. The very same society that banned any open, honest discussion of female desire had, through its own strange and convoluted logic, managed to make medically induced orgasms a routine, and sometimes even a prescribed, part of a woman's health care. It was pleasure laundered through the clinic. This strange and silent arrangement continued for decades. That is, until the technology of motion pictures came along, when these therapeutic devices started appearing in the background of early, underground erotic films. The unspoken secret was finally out. The illusion of medical legitimacy instantly collapsed. Doctors and medical journals quickly began to distance themselves from the practice, and the vibrator was swiftly reclassified from a helpful medical tool into a shameful, taboo object of vice. The whole story of hysteria is a chilling and perfect example of how the language of science can be twisted to enforce social control. In the Victorian world, a man's melancholy might earn him the reputation of being a deep, romantic poet, but a woman's melancholy would earn her a diagnosis, weeks of forced bed rest, and a prescription for a pelvic massage. Many of these treatments were designed not to heal, but to break a woman's spirit under the polite banner of healing. The so-called rest cures were particularly cruel. They involved weeks of total isolation in a darkened room, with bland diets and absolute inactivity. In the most extreme versions, women were not allowed to sit up to speak freely, or even to feed themselves, making them as helpless as infants. The diagnosis was a perfect, inescapable trap. A wife who challenged her husband's authority could be labeled hysterical. A daughter who resisted an arranged marriage could be labeled hysterical. And the more a woman protested her diagnosis, the more her resistance was seen as proof that the diagnosis was correct. It was a cage made of logic, and it closed silently around her. But at the very same time, a thriving secret, underground world existed just beneath the surface of all this public propriety. While the daytime world was governed by strict etiquette and church sermons, the night belonged to shadowed storefronts and private clubs that catered to a very different and much more honest kind of human curiosity. The new invention of photography, for example, quickly created a discreet but booming market for nude images. Studios, often operating behind false business names, would produce carefully staged photographs of nude women. To give them an air of artistic respectability, the models were often posed in classical scenes, draped in gauze like Greek goddesses, or perched on imitation rocks like mythical nymphs. But these were not for anatomy textbooks or serious art students. This was desire filtered through a respectable, artistic lens. The buyers were often the very same upper-class gentlemen who were the loudest public champions of moral purity. They would collect these images in secret, claiming they were merely for artistic study or to appreciate the play of light on the human form. This hypocrisy was simply everywhere you looked. In the streets of London, a proper woman could be publicly shamed for accidentally showing a bare ankle from beneath her skirt. But in the privacy of a photographer's studio, a woman could remove everything but a single silk ribbon and still be considered tasteful art, so long as the lighting was soft and the title of the photograph was something poetic. The rules of morality didn't apply universally. They were all about context, class, and plausible deniability. After years of being guarded and monitored, the ultimate test for any respectable young woman was her wedding night. But this moment, so often romanticized, was rarely about connection. It was about confirmation. In the cold, clinical view of Victorian society, the wedding night was a final inspection. The bride was not there simply to consummate a marriage. She was there to perform a biological function, and her body was expected to provide the final, undeniable proof of her virtue. The pressure on these young brides was immense and suffocating. Most of them had been taught absolutely nothing about their own bodies, or what to expect physically or emotionally. They entered the marriage bed in a state of near total ignorance, armed only with vague, whispered advice from their mothers, which usually amounted to 3 simple instructions: lie still, endure it, and pray. That single night, which they had been taught to fear for years, became the terrifying focal point of their entire existence. This obsession with proof turned the most private of acts into a public audit. The bedsheet became a witness, the mattress a courtroom, and the husband its judge. The expectation of blood on the sheets was so ingrained that in some families, particularly among the upper classes, the stained cloth was actually brought out the next morning and displayed to close relatives or even senior servants. It was a crude, silent announcement that the family's honor had been preserved, and if the sheet remained clean, the bride was automatically and immediately blamed. There was no room for nuance or understanding. It was almost never considered that bleeding might not occur for a host of perfectly natural reasons. That the hymen might have stretched or torn from exercise, or that some women simply don't bleed at all. In the black and white morality of the time, a lack of blood, a lack of virtue, period. To make this impossible situation even worse, any sign of enthusiasm or pleasure from the bride was considered deeply suspicious. A woman who relaxed into the moment, who smiled, or who seemed to feel any kind of enjoyment, would immediately raise alarming questions in her new husband's mind. Where did she learn to behave that way? He might wonder. Whom had she practiced with? This twisted logic turned a natural human response into a cause for alarm, forcing women to perform a strange and delicate theatre of reluctant innocence. This intense fear of failing the wedding night test led to another secret, desperate, and underground practice. A woman who feared she might not pass inspection could seek out a backroom practitioner, often a midwife or a disgraced doctor, to have her hymen crudely stitched back together. The procedure was as brutal as it sounds, performed with a simple needle and thread, usually in a poorly lit room with no anesthesia and no sterilization. This wasn't an act of malice or an attempt to trick a good man. For these women, it was a sheer act of survival. This crudely stitched hymen wasn't designed to last. It was designed to do one thing: to tear and bleed on the wedding night, satisfying the cruel, clinical demands of the culture. It was a painful, dangerous lie, but it was also a shield against a system that offered no mercy and no second chances. This rigid private morality was reinforced by an equally rigid legal system. A law called the Obscene Publications Act of 1857 gave the authorities broad and sweeping power to seize and destroy any material that was deemed to have the tendency to deprave and corrupt, and the definition of obscene was left intentionally vague, allowing it to be used against almost anything that challenged the era's strict moral code. This law wasn't just used to prosecute what we would think of as pornography. It was actively used against literature and art. A poem did not have to explicitly describe anything sexual to be banned. It only had to imply desire in a way that was considered inappropriate or outside the bounds of marital duty. For a few suggestive lines, writers could be arrested, publishers could be fined, and booksellers could have their entire stock confiscated. Under this climate of fear, even your private love letters were not safe. If a passionate letter between two lovers was discovered, it could be read aloud in a courtroom and used as evidence of moral corruption. The most personal, tender words a person could write were stripped of their context and twisted into a cold, public confession of shame, ruining reputations and ending careers. This paranoid fear of the written word reached its tragic peak with the infamous trial of the celebrated playwright and literary figure Oscar Wilde. Wilde was a man famous for his wit and elegance, but when he was put on trial, the prosecution used his own art against him. His passionate, poetic letters to his young male lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, were presented as central to the case and read aloud in the courtroom as hard evidence of his depravity and criminal behavior. Wilde was ultimately convicted under a nasty piece of legislation from 1885 known as the La Bouche-Airy Amendment. This law made any act of gross indecency between men a crime, whether it happened in public or in private. It was a deliberately vague charge, one that didn't require any proof of sodomy, and it became the primary legal tool used to persecute gay men for the next several decades. Oscar Wilde was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor, a punishment that utterly broke him. When he emerged from prison, he was physically ruined and socially destroyed, a ghost of his former self. His case sent a chilling message to all of England in this world. Your words, your art, and even your most private thoughts could be weaponized and used to bring about your complete destruction. To survive in such a hostile world, those who felt same-sex desires had to learn to live in the shadows and speak in elaborate codes. A hidden vocabulary developed, allowing people to recognize one another without attracting unwanted attention. One of the most famous of these was the silent language of flowers. In this secret code, a simple green carnation pinned to a man's lapel could signal to those in the know that he was interested in other men. For women, the situation was different, but no less difficult. Female same-sex relationships were not explicitly criminalized in the same way, largely because the male lawmakers of the time refused to believe such relationships could even truly exist. It's famously reported that when a law against lesbianism was proposed, Queen Victoria herself struck it down, dismissing the entire idea as impossible nonsense. But this legal invisibility did not mean freedom. It meant silence and a different kind of erasure. Women could live together as companions without immediate suspicion, but if their attachment became too visible or too passionate, they risked being pathologized. A woman expressing unnatural affection for another woman wouldn't be sent to prison. She'd be labeled hysterical and quietly sent to a mental institution. But even within the most respectable and rule-bound homes, human desire still found strange outlets. Among the aristocracy, where every gesture was rehearsed, bizarre and theatrical party games became popular. These games, played late at night after the formal dinner was over, provided a rare, socially acceptable excuse for brief moments of physical contact without any real consequence. One of the strangest and most talked about of these was the keyhole kiss. The game began by locking a door between two rooms, with only the tiny, circular keyhole connecting them. Guests were then blindfolded, and one person was placed on each side of the door. Neither person had any idea who was on the other side. A guide would then gently position their heads so their lips could meet for a brief, anonymous kiss through the keyhole. The entire thrill of the game came from that absolute anonymity. You had no idea whose lips had just met yours. Was it a friend? A stranger? Your husband's biggest rival? For just a brief, dizzying moment, a married woman might kiss a young man without blame, or a powerful nobleman might flirt with a servant from his own household. The rigid social hierarchy of the Victorian world would completely dissolve in that one small, shared secret. This obsession with control extended beyond games and into the most basic parts of life, including the furniture in the bedroom. In some of the most deeply devout or morally anxious aristocratic homes, couples began using what they called therapeutic or moral beds. These strange pieces of furniture were not designed for comfort or health. They were designed with one specific goal in mind: to ensure that marital intercourse could take place without the actual physical intimacy. These so-called moral beds were feats of anti-intimacy engineering. They often featured a thick wooden partition that ran down the middle, physically separating the husband and wife as they lay side by side. The only point of connection was a single, carefully measured hole in the center of the board, just large enough to permit the act of intercourse and nothing more. Any other form of closeness, touching, embracing, kissing, or even just looking at one another, was made physically impossible by the very design of the furniture. And this wasn't a joke or a satirical invention. It was a real practice, seen by those who used it as a deeply dignified and spiritual elevated way to fulfill their marital duties without ever falling into the supposed sin of enjoyment. It was, in many ways, the ultimate physical expression of a culture that was terrified of human closeness, a culture that sought to sanitize and control the most fundamental of human connections until it was as sterile as a surgical procedure. This desire to control every aspect of life extended even to family planning, which was often governed by pure superstition. In many respectable households, couples kept what were known as conception calendars, meticulously tracking the days of the month. They operated on the bizarre belief that engaging in intercourse on certain days, specifically on even-numbered calendar days, would somehow harm the child being conceived, dooming it to be physically weak, mentally unstable, or morally flawed. The immense pressure of enforcing this strange and arbitrary schedule fell entirely on the wife. It became one of her many silent duties, and the system was merciless. If a child happened to be born with any kind of ailment, and it was discovered that he or she had been conceived on a forbidden Monday, for example, the mother would be directly blamed for her failure to follow the calendar's rules. The randomness of nature was ignored. It had to be her fault. The fear of female sexuality, and the lengths people would go to control it, was so intense that it even led to the revival of a grim device from the Middle Ages, the chastity belt. But this time, it wasn't a rusty relic from a museum. It returned not as a myth, but as a real, purchasable product, now marketed with the clean, modern language of science, hygiene, and concerned paternal care. These 19th century versions were a bit more refined than their medieval counterparts. They were often flat metal belts, sometimes padded with cotton or lined with soft leather, and were designed to be worn discreetly under a girl's clothing. But they all featured one crucial element, a lock, which could only be opened by someone else. And the person who held the key was typically the girl's own father. The justification for this was always the same. It was for the girl's protection. Fathers and doctors claimed these belts would prevent the evils of self-abuse, deter any potential assault, and guarantee a girl's purity until her wedding day. But beneath all that caring language, the real motive was about absolute ownership. A good father, it was argued, protected his daughter's virtue, even from herself, turning her body into a locked property to which he held the only key. Even a woman's everyday clothing became a primary tool of control. Her undergarments, in particular, were not just about modesty, they became her physical boundaries. The corset, for example, was so much more than just a tool for creating a fashionable silhouette. For the Victorians, it was a crucial method of physical regulation, a way to enforce discipline from the outside in. Laced incredibly tightly, often by a maid or a mother, a corset made it physically difficult for a woman to bend freely at the waist. It restricted her breathing and, very deliberately, made it logistically impossible for her to reach or touch certain parts of her own body. In a masterful act of social conditioning, this state of physical immobility was reframed as elegance, and the constant, low-grade pain it caused was seen as a virtuous sign of moral superiority. This restrictive logic created the ultimate paradox: the popularity of sheer, see-through nightgowns, which were often labelled as perfectly proper and moral. The twisted reasoning was that these garments, made of the thinnest lace or gauze, served the same purpose as the corset. A husband could see the outline of his wife's form, but the restrictive cut and construction of the gown still made it difficult for the woman herself to move freely or touch her own body. It was a garment designed for viewing, not for living in. For women in the lower classes, clothing was used for control in an even more sinister and humiliating way. In many wealthy households, it was an unwritten rule that female domestic servants, especially the young housemaids, were required to wear thin, simple cotton dresses, often without any petticoats or other undergarments. The fabric was often so sheer that in the right light, the complete outline of their figures could be seen as they worked. This was a deliberate, calculated act of humiliation and control. It served to constantly remind the servant of her vulnerable and inferior position in the household, and, of course, it offered the men of the house a constant, deniable source of voyeuristic pleasure, allowing them to gaze upon the female staff in a way that society publicly condemned. The mistress of the house was often the one who most strictly enforced this rule, justifying it with the claim that wearing such simple, revealing clothing would prevent the maids from becoming vain or trying to seduce the men of the family. But in reality, it was about pure dominance, a way of ensuring that the servant's body, like the silverware and the furniture, was just another piece of the household's property. In this culture of constant anxiety, beauty products were also weaponized. A market emerged for so-called virtue tonics, which were sold to women with the promise that they would eliminate lustful thoughts, calm the passions, and help preserve a woman's natural chastity. Women drank them dutifully, believing they were purifying their souls. But these tonics were not harmless herbal remedies. They were secretly laced with low doses of actual poisons, like mercury, lead, and antimony. The poisons worked, in a sense. They made the women who drank them feel lethargic, listless, and ill, a state of being that was then misinterpreted as the tonic working to successfully calm their passions and purify their thoughts. The physical symptoms of this slow poisoning, chronic nausea, stomach pain, and even hair loss, were often seen as positive signs. Many women came to believe that their suffering meant the tonic was working, that if their body was aching, it must mean their soul was healing. It was a quiet, insidious form of self-destruction, all in the name of being seen as a good and passionless woman. The moral panic was so pervasive that even the postal system wasn't considered safe. A strange and incredibly risky trend emerged where courting couples, forbidden from touching, would secretly send each other pieces of their undergarments through the mail. A scented handkerchief, a ribbon from a petticoat, or a small piece of lace became a secret token of a physical intimacy that could not be spoken aloud. This was a quiet, desperate rebellion against a touch-starved culture. But if a postal inspector, empowered by obscenity laws, intercepted a package containing a piece of lingerie, the sender could be prosecuted for distributing lewd and obscene materials. A man might get a warning, but a woman risked everything: her reputation, her job, her marriage prospects, all for a single, tender gesture. The system of control began so early that puberty itself was treated as a moral crisis. A young girl's natural development was not seen as a biological stage, but as a potential sign of spiritual and moral decay. A girl who began to develop too early, or who seemed too curious about the changes in her body, could be labeled as troubled and was said to be suffering from a condition called precocious sensuality. She would then be taken to a doctor to be corrected. These so-called treatments were designed to punish a girl's body for developing naturally. They could include anything from cold baths and electric shocks to, in the most extreme and horrific cases, genital cauterization or other surgical interventions. These were justified as moral cures, and through them, a young girl was taught to fear her own growth as a sign of her innate corruption. But not all women accepted this oppressive fate passively. While public rebellion was nearly impossible, a quiet and deeply personal resistance was taking place behind the locked doors of their bedrooms. In the pages of small, secret notebooks, many women began to document the rich inner lives they were forced to hide from the world. These were not diaries filled with notes on gardening, recipes, or society gossip. They were brave, secret accounts of their real thoughts and forbidden feelings. These journals, often bound in leather and secured with tiny locks and keys, became their only truly safe space in a world that demanded their silence. Here, they could explore their longing, their confusion, and their deep frustration with the suffocating rules that governed their lives. They often wrote in coded language or veiled allegories, knowing all too well that if their diary was ever discovered, the consequences would be catastrophic. A woman could be disowned by her family, or worse, quietly sent away to a mental institution, labeled as disturbed or hysterical, for simply writing down the truth of her experience. In the rigid Victorian mindset, a woman's private, passionate thoughts were not seen as a sign of a rich inner life or a sharp intelligence. Instead, they were viewed as a symptom of a moral disease, a spiritual infection that needed to be stamped out. The very act of a woman trying to understand her own body and her own heart was treated not as a quest for knowledge, but as a crime of morality. It's heartbreaking to think that, in a different time, many of these women might have become celebrated novelists, poets, or philosophers. They were sharp, observant, and deeply aware of the contradictions of their world. But in the Victorian era, that very awareness was a liability, and so their secret diaries became their only outlet. Quiet, lonely acts of rebellion, written on paper that could be burned at a moment's notice. And now we come to one final, deeply uncomfortable story from this era, one that perhaps shows the ultimate hypocrisy of the entire system. In the quiet, sterile wards of some military hospitals, a strange and unspoken duty fell to the female nurses. For the male soldiers who returned from the battlefields of the Empire, suffering from paralysis or other traumatic injuries, help sometimes came in forms that could never, ever be publicly acknowledged. This was never an official, written-down duty. It was a silent, unwritten expectation, passed down in whispers from a doctor or a senior matron. In some hospitals, certain nurses were quietly expected to provide manual release for these injured men. The act was framed not as sexual, but as therapeutic, a necessary part of care designed to help a broken man feel whole again. The act itself was hidden in medical charts under cold, clinical euphemisms like peripheral circulatory stimulation or manual intervention, and it is here that we find the final, chilling irony of the Victorian age. The very same society that so viciously condemned women for having any sexual desires of their own would, in the private and controlled setting of a hospital, assign them the silent duty of servicing a man's physical needs, all under the respectable guise of medical care. It was a level of moral gymnastics that is truly staggering to behold. When you step back and look at the whole picture, you see that this entire, complicated system was built on one single foundation: control. It was about the control of the body, the control of thought, and the control of feeling. And nowhere was that control more fiercely and desperately applied than in the simple, suffocating belief that a respectable woman, a good woman, must not want. The core belief of the era was that female pleasure was an error, a biological mistake, or an illness of the soul that needed to be corrected. A woman's role in marriage and in life was to endure, not to enjoy. She was to be a passive, beautiful vessel for her husband's desires and her family's ambitions, with no messy, inconvenient desires of her own to complicate things. This created a world of impossible contradictions. A woman smiling after intimacy with her husband could be showing the early signs of hysteria. A wife who dared to initiate affection was seen as behaving in an unnatural, almost predatory way. In this environment, the only truly safe option was silence. The safest bride and the safest wife was always the silent one. And so, over time, this system turned the potential for joy into a source of constant, nagging guilt. While the Industrial Revolution was pushing society forward with steam engines and new technologies, the emotional progress inside the home was brought to a screeching halt. Women were taught to fear the most natural parts of themselves, and to be ashamed of the very feelings that make us human. But we must remember that private acts of rebellion always existed. Even in the darkest and most restrictive of times, the human spirit finds a way. Women found moments of genuine love and freedom, even within the confines of rigid marriages. They wrote the truth in their secret diaries. They whispered flirtations through keyholes in silly party games. And they sent forbidden, heartfelt letters, risking everything for a moment of connection. Slowly, so slowly, as the century began to turn, a few brave voices began to push back against the crushing weight of these double standards. Early feminists and social reformers started to question why the rules for men and women were so different. And even some progressive doctors began to cautiously update their views, suggesting that perhaps female desire wasn't a disease after all. They started to question the whole rotten system. They questioned the bogus medical diagnoses that were used to silence women. They questioned the restrictive, physically damaging clothing that was passed off as fashion. And most importantly, they began to question the suffocating culture of silence that had dominated for so long. But the shadows of that era were long and dark. The deep-seated shame and the constant feeling of being watched that so defined Victorian sexuality didn't just disappear overnight. They lingered for generations, passed down from mother to daughter in whispered warnings and unspoken rules, shaping the way we think about our bodies and our desires even today. The strange, repressed, and often cruel sexual landscape of the Victorian era wasn't just about a lack of scientific knowledge. It was a world shaped by something much deeper, a profound fear of the human body and an absolute terror of the self. It was a society that chose order over happiness and control over connection. And so, as we close this quiet chapter of history, it's a powerful reminder of how the stories a society tells itself can shape the lives of everyone within it. These weren't just random, quirky customs. They were the symptoms of a world that had become afraid of its own heart. Every single rule we've explored tonight, from the moral beds to the poison tonics, was at its core a desperate and ultimately futile attempt to control something that can never truly be caged, the human spirit. Thank you so much for staying with me through these strange, and I know, often unsettling stories. It's a journey that takes patience, and I'm grateful you chose to take it with me tonight. And now, may your night be free of corsets, chastity belts, and any hidden fears. Sleep gently, and may your dreams be far softer and far freer than Victorian morality ever allowed.